Namaste and welcome to the Bharatvaarta podcast. In the first of our long India series, where we speak to people who are optimistic about India's growth prospects in this new decade, we have Preethi Kasireddy. She's an entrepreneur, writer, and a popular commentator on social media. Preethi is passionate about various aspects of India, from our culture to a thriving startup ecosystem, and we'll try to understand her optimism in further detail in the course of this conversation. So, without further ado, welcome, Preethi. Thank you so much for making the time.
Awesome. Excited to be here.
Hey, so before we, dive deep in, could you give our listeners a brief background about yourself?
Yeah, sure. So I'm a writer, entrepreneur, investor. My background, I was an engineer by trade, and I moved to Silicon Valley after college, and I worked at Goldman Sachs as an investment banker, and then Andreessen Horowitz, I was a venture capitalist there. So I did tech investing, and then I decided that I wanted to learn how to code because I felt like one day I wanted to start my own company, or at least like have the opportunity to start my own company. And I felt like if I wanted to do that, I needed to learn how to code. I didn't want to be the type of founder that relied on a technical CEO to build my company. So that's when I left Andreessen Horowitz to basically teach myself how to code. And then I joined Coinbase as an engineer so I can get some experience coding. And so I spent some time there, and that's when I first got into the whole crypto world. And then after Coinbase, I spent a few months just independently working with different crypto projects during the 2017 hype cycle. And then once the hype cycle sort of died, I eventually started my own company called True Story, and we're building an application where we can use crypto to basically incentivize people to debate and not lie when they make claims on the internet. We spent 2 years building that, and unfortunately, we decided to shut down the company because we felt like while we definitely agreed with the idea, we didn't feel like the timing was right because a lot of the infrastructure and tooling and just even consumer mindset was not ready for something like that. So we shut that down in about a year ago, and ever since then, I've been sort of taking a break and just figuring out what's next for me personally.
All right. Yeah, thanks so much for that. Uh, okay, let's begin with the central theme of our discussion. What are you optimistic for India as we enter this new decade?
What am I optimistic about? I think like India has always had the talent. I've always seen that, like all Indians that I've known in school, in college, we were always like the smartest people in the room. And so it always was strange to me whenever I looked at India and I'd be like, how come India is not on the global um, like platform? Why aren't they as competitive as the US or more competitive? And ultimately, I realized that like from a technological point of view, they were just behind. And like things like access to the internet and access to good education was just not there. And so even though there were smart Indians or smart and intelligent, the they were a lot of them were kind of being exported out of the country to come to the US, and so they weren't really producing for India itself. Um, but I always I kind of had this in the back of my mind. I was like, there's really strong talent there, and I felt like at some point in time, there's going to be a moment where this talent can actually have the ability to flourish, and I feel like we're finally at that stage, and it's because of a whole host of things. One of the biggest things I believe is access to internet because of the geo effect in India that very few people knew about. But I wrote a thread about it a few weeks ago. Because of the geo effect, I mean, you guys know now so many Indians have access to internet, and now entrepreneurs are able to basically be on the same level field as entrepreneurs in the US
Yeah.
because they have access to the same tools, and they have access to the same knowledge, and they have access to the same network through places like Twitter and stuff. And so it was amazing for me to go to India in 2016 and again in 2020 and get to meet Indian entrepreneurs. And I was like, these entrepreneurs are not any worse off than entrepreneurs in Silicon Valley. In fact, I felt like some of them were just as good as entrepreneurs in Silicon Valley. So that's when it kind of clicked for me that I was like, there's something that happened in the last 5 years that really changed the game of entrepreneurship in India, where um, the quality of entrepreneurs is just like 10x.
Yeah.
And it's definitely because of the access to the internet and the knowledge sharing that exists now. And once you have entrepreneurship, I mean, the world is your oyster, right? Because now you have all these kids and teens and 20, 30-year-olds who have the ability to experiment with different ideas and try different things to solve different problems in India and globally. And I think that's definitely going to happen in the next decade. And I mean, there's a whole bunch of other things, but I think like on the growth and quality of entrepreneurship in India is one of the biggest driving factors.
Yeah. No, even about 10 or 12 years back, I mean, we were sort of naive, I think. And the quality of founders and startups have, dramatically gone up in the last 5 years, right? And due to various reasons that you just mentioned. Um, do you see that? Do you see that as a compelling change, though? I mean, that people have started looking at India as built for India and so on.
Do I see what as a compelling change?
The earlier brain drain that we spoke about, right? People
Yeah.
being exported out of here. Do you see that sort of reversed as such right now? I mean, people wanting to come, maybe if not come back to India, maybe build out of India or build for
Got it.
India.
Yeah, I think the brain drain is still going to happen for the next couple of years, but I think it's definitely going to slow down as um, India is seen as a like emerging mar- um, like a new frontier, right? Because like I think entrepreneurs previously, like when if you came to the US, you were thought of as successful, right?
Mm.
Like even in India, my family, for example, my mom and dad immigrated from India to the US because like the gold standard in India is if you get a chance to go to the US, you're considered
Yeah,
successful. Um, and I think that mentality and that mentality about the US, it's going to take some time for it to like wane and almost like not matter because that's like a huge mental shift for people. But as more and more people either stay in India or come back to India um, to like build their careers, as more and more people do that, other entrepreneurs will see that happening and will want to stay. Because the reality is like the India market is so unique because the Indian culture is so unique. So even I know so many people who've kind of left India to come to the US, but it never feels like home to them. Like the Indian blood is just in all of us, and to just completely transplant ourselves and expect to fully integrate, it's really hard. And so I think a lot of people who feel that deep connection to their roots will end up going back because the opportunities are there now. We
yeah,
just need a few early people um, to to showcase successful. Basically, we need like a few good case studies of this happening. Well-known people who are coming back to India and building a meaningful career, and then it'll become sort of like a more popular thing, I guess.
yeah, yeah. I think so too. So, 2020 was an unprecedented year. In the same time that many developed countries, struggle to cope with COVID and everything, we've done fairly well, I would say, right? Thank God for that. And, we've adjusted to this new paradigm fairly well. What new opportunities do you see emerging out of this for India specifically?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, like the biggest thing, and it's sort of obvious, is the move remote is going to become a norm now, right? It's no longer just something that is on the edge cases. It's just more and more people are going to find that they rather work remotely so that they have their hours of the day rather than commuting. They rather spend that time with family or doing things they love to do, right? And so as we move into this remote culture, it, location doesn't really matter anymore. You can work for any company from anywhere. And once that happens, then why would then like Indian entrepreneurs now have an opportunity to kind of shine on the global economics stage, I guess. And so what COVID really did is it leveled the playing field for entrepreneurs all around the world. And I think that's something that's totally going to be is probably underestimated now, but will have huge ramifications in like 5, 10 years from now.
Yeah.
Because even when I was working at Andreessen Horowitz, like location really mattered. We only invested in entrepreneurs who were based in Silicon Valley. For us to even make an investment in New York was a big hurdle because the travel required to actually, go to board meetings with these entrepreneurs and stuff was just too much of a hindrance. But now, like board meetings are all going to be digital. Everything is going to be remote. So like, what's to say that you can't invest in a company in like Zimbabwe or India or anywhere in the world? And so again, it really levels the playing field, and this is the perfect time for Indian entrepreneurs to kind of shine in that world.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, if you're going to work for a Silicon Valley based company out of, let's say, Austin or somewhere, I mean, you might as well work for it from Bombay or Bangalore, right? I mean, what
Yeah,
difference does it make? Yeah.
yeah,
So, you've spoken about the geo effect, right? How cheap
yep,
internet has transformed connectivity services here. I think we have the largest monthly consumption of data in the world. It was somewhere around 12 GB in 2019. I'm sure that would have gone up many times last year, right? How will 5G accelerate this growth, in your opinion?
yeah. I honestly haven't done as much research into 5G. Um, I just mostly because I'm philosophically not supportive of 5G because I know that it has um, really negative ramifications in terms of like EMF radiation, and a lot of people these days are discovering how sensitive they are to EMF radiation and stuff. So philosophically, I don't agree with 5G because who knows what that's going to do to our brains and bodies and stuff.
Right.
But I think like hopefully they'll figure out safer ways to distribute 5G internet without destroying the human brain and neurological stuff. But let's put all of that aside and assuming that 5G is completely safe to deploy. If that's the case, then I think obviously that's gonna magnify the geo effect, right? Because like I mean, I guess like this is a question for you. Like from what I learned is that the geo effect has made data in India so cheap that like the cost is not really a barrier
Yeah.
anymore. Um, so then, like, what benefit would 5G really bring? Is it
Right.
speed and speed? Is that the only thing? Or like, what is the real benefit there?
Yeah, so it's connectivity and speed, right? So
Yeah,
at this point of time, I mean, you know, the next frontier could be virtualization, and considering
I
how
see.
services are going to evolve, right? So I think as you mentioned, it's a pretty remote world right now. So I kind of see all kinds of innovation happening out of India. I mean, people, I don't know, like my friend Harsh Gupta says, people probably teaching yoga from here.
Yeah,
To different parts of the world. I mean, probably teaching mathematics to different parts of the world and so on, right? And yeah, I mean, I think it's really going to be the next wave of innovation out of here, I feel.
yeah. I agree. That makes sense. So, in terms of connectivity, I guess I think like when I was in India, even when I was trying to upload a YouTube video, it took like 12 hours, even though I shrunk the size and everything, and it was like pretty cost prohibitive. So I can see what you mean in terms of like with 5G, it'll even further sort of level the playing field
Yeah.
for whether it's YouTube stars or any kind of virtual economy stuff. So yeah.
Right. Yeah. So, we spoke about this very briefly. One thing that, we've seen over the last 10 or 15 years is that the startup ecosystem here is kind of matured, right? And you
Yep.
spoke about talking to entrepreneurs as well. We're still, I think, 4 or 5 decades behind Silicon Valley because, I mean, obviously they had a head start and stuff like that. But what about this emerging startup ecosystem specifically, is exciting for you?
First, I'll say that I don't think India is 4 or 5 decades ahead. I
I
mean,
would say they have
I
a
don't
head
think
start, I suppose.
I don't think Silicon Valley has 4 or 5 decades head start. I would say at most they're probably 5 to 8 years ahead of
Okay.
India, because if you think about it, when was like
Yeah.
companies like
No, I meant,
Snapchat?
sorry, I
Yeah.
meant in terms of when it began. It began in the 60s, right? The whole Silicon Valley innovation wave as
No,
such.
I mean, yeah, I mean, like, you can argue that like it began then, but really when the first internet companies were started was like in the 90s and 2000s.
Yeah.
Um,
AOL and
so
stuff,
I
yeah.
think like yeah, like Amazon, and then we had like the 2000 like the dot-com bust. Really, the true innovation in the internet company started after the dot-com bust. So that was like not until like mid
2000.
2000s almost. So yeah, India is probably a decade behind at most.
Right.
Um, so that's why the coming decade is actually going to be super important if you just look at sort of the history of the US and that curve. Um, and that point, what was the question that you originally asked?
No, I mean, anything that you're specifically excited about in this startup ecosystem as such?
In the startup ecosystem, yeah. I mean, I'm excited about it a lot. I think the India market, again, it's so unique. India is its own culture, its own nation. It's been isolated for hundreds of years. And so it has its own unique problems that no other country in the world has. And so I don't have I'm not on the ground day to day, so I don't have the knowledge of the type of problems that India has anymore. I was on the ground when I was younger, but I definitely know that there's just local problems to solve that are big enough markets for all these entrepreneurs to solve.
Yeah.
That's one. On a more global scale, I think things like crypto, um, things like fintech, which is already blowing up in India, and India is way ahead of the U.S. even in their
Yeah.
payment system and stuff. So the crypto and fintech are going to be huge. And beyond that, I think it's hard to say like what else Indian entrepreneurs will succeed in. I mean, the world is kind of their oyster at this point. But I really do think for some reason fintech and crypto are going to be two areas that like Indian entrepreneurs could shine in, assuming the government doesn't do the thing of trying to ban
Yeah.
crypto,
Yeah.
because that would be a huge disservice not only to the country but to entrepreneurs there.
Yeah.
And as we're seeing with COVID and 2021, the importance of decentralized technology is becoming only more and more evident to a lot more people with all the deplatforming happening and everything. And so it's pretty clear to everyone now that we need decentralized alternatives to all the things that exist today, whether it's social networks or money. And the countries and entrepreneurs who build those platforms are the ones that are going to succeed in the next decade. And if India decides to ban crypto, they're basically completely cutting off the opportunity they have to be that innovator in the next decade. And I think that'd be a huge disservice to India as a whole.
Yeah. No, I think anytime we're unsure about something, I think the government just decides to ban it, right? So I think they're
Yeah, I
yet
mean,
to
like,
understand the full
yeah, it's
implications of it. Yeah.
yeah, it's one of those things. Like, I mean, from what I understood, like India government is so focused on they have so many other problems to solve.
Yeah.
Things like the black markets and all this stuff that they're trying to fix. Education is another big thing on their minds. So for them, crypto is almost this like other thing they have to deal with.
Yeah.
And I think I can understand why they're being super short-sighted about it, because they're like, we'll come to this after we deal with other priorities, basically.
Exactly.
But it's one of those things where the earlier, like you don't want to hop on the boat when everyone else has hopped on the boat, right? And I think historically that's what India has done, whether
Right.
it's whatever technology, even the internet. India is a late adopter to the internet compared to, for example, US and other developed nations. So if in like this is the chance for India to not be the late adopter and to actually be an early adopter in it.
Yeah.
And as much as exciting as that idea sounds, I'm just not sure culturally if that's what the government is willing to do, right?
Yeah.
Because the government in India typically tends to be a little bit more conservative. And I don't, but like, but again, they continue to surprise me because things like India Stack, like
Yeah.
that's incredibly innovative. That's incredibly future.
Yeah.
That's a lot of foresight, right?
Yeah.
And they're like, you can't argue that that required a lot of innovation and advanced thinking. So then it makes me wonder, like, if they can come up with something like India Stack that is way ahead of the US and
Yeah.
basically every payment system in the world, I don't understand like why they don't see the value in crypto, right?
Right.
I think this is what a lot of entrepreneurs are sitting there scratching their head about. It's like, it's like it makes sense to us that crypto makes sense, and why doesn't it make sense to them? The obvious argument seems to be, it's going to be used for illegal activity, black markets, and all that. But I mean, like every tool is used for good and bad.
Yeah.
In fact, like on-chain activity is probably easier to track and monitor than completely cash-based economies. So only time will tell. I think we just need more entrepreneurs to kind of be activists in this and keep pushing back until hopefully some government officials start to actually listen.
Yeah. No, I think the real fear is that it'll affect monetary policy, and we won't be able to control certain aspects of the economy
Yep.
if we adopt crypto. I think so. Yesterday, Balaji Srinivasan put out a really nice blog post on why we should buy Bitcoin, not ban it, right?
Yeah.
And he addressed this point specifically, where he said that if you have all of these gold reserves, you might as well buy Bitcoin, which is again decentralized and also acting like a sort of a digital gold reserve, as such, a universal gold reserve, right? So I'm actually optimistic that things might change. I mean, as you said, they haven't really gotten around to this problem of crypto as such. I mean, they still are solving 30 other problems that are top of mind. So uh, any other thing on the fintech front that you're excited about? So you spoke about India Stack, which again, regulators have been super proactive and in developing this along with the ecosystem, right? They've built it in a very API-fied way. Um, do you see that we could probably innovate for innovate for the world, like outside of India as well, from a fintech perspective?
Yeah, I mean, like, I think already there's a lot of countries that are requesting the same technology be deployed in their own countries. Like, I think Singapore is one of them. I forget a few other ones that are also looking into launching what India Stack did. Look, I think what India Stack is exactly what every like if we could rip apart the U.S. financial system and rebuild it from scratch, we would basically build India Stack.
Yeah.
So like it's advanced. It's absolutely the future. Now the question is, can we make that not just an India stack but a global stack, right? I think that's the question you're trying to ask. Because if India can do that, that's huge too.
Yeah.
And maybe if the government's plan is actually that, maybe they don't want crypto because they want India stack to be global. Who knows? I don't know. But I definitely think India Stack can be global. There's nothing proprietary about what they're building except for the fact that it plugs into proprietary banks. But if they can open source that technology and allow all banks to adopt it, then that becomes a global technology. And India is the founder of that, right? So that'd be
Yeah.
really cool.
Yeah. So one thing also that you've spoken about is the education, right? I mean, NEP, and also you're pretty passionate about education. I mean, you
Yeah.
have a few thoughts on that. Uh, we often hear about this demographic dividend, that we have the largest number of young people in the world and so on, right? But in order for these people to leverage all of the opportunities that are going to come their way this decade, we'll have to focus on what kind of education and skills they get, right? So they can capitalize on all of this. Any thoughts on that in terms of what we should do, what we should not do?
And I think I wrote that blog post and thread about the ed tech in India. And when I first went into researching this stuff, I didn't expect it to be that forward thinking, but it looks like India, the government is really thinking ahead of the game in this. And one of the things I really realized in my research is the government really understands the problems. They're not like blind to the fact that there's a lot of issues with the education system in India. So, I mean, the first step of solving any problem is actually to identify the problem. So it's encouraging that they actually, see it for what it is rather than being ignorant about it. Two, I think that the solutions that they have in place are probably the best that's possible, especially in like a more public school setting where there's a lot of making change is much harder than a private setting. But I think so. Like from a government perspective, I think they're doing all the right things. I can't think of anything more necessarily they can do. But I do think from a private sector point of view, meaning technology companies and ed tech companies, I think there can be a lot more innovation there. And I think we're starting to see the early wave of that with like Baiju and White Hat and stuff like that.
Right.
And I sense that that will continue to grow. And, historically, when I was at A16Z, EdTech was a sector that we didn't really invest in because for some reason, when you look at like from an economic point of view, education is just not valued economically as much as other sectors like finance and fintech and stuff like that. EdTech companies get like what $1 billion valuations at most or something. Even companies like Duolingo, which are really, really cool apps, they don't end up making that much money and they're not highly valued from in the public markets either. So there's very little, there's not that much ed tech innovation in the US.
Yeah.
That's what I'm trying to say.
No, I think
Um,
yeah. So partly because I think it was very services led, right? I mean, you had to have classrooms, teachers, students, and that kind of thing. But then, I mean, what you're realizing now is that that can really scale with remote technologies and so on. So yeah,
yeah, exactly. And another thing with the US is like, unlike, I think in India, education is so much more valued than in the
yeah,
US. Like not that the US doesn't value education, but more that like, Indian parents grill children from a very young age into the importance of studying, importance of education. So I think the Indian market will value edtech companies much higher than
yeah.
the US market will value edtech companies. And that will incentivize entrepreneurs to build edtech companies because again, it's like it's in our blood to just really value education.
Yeah.
That I don't see that same feeling and emotion towards education in the US. It's just different. So I'm excited for edtech in India.
Just a slight diversion on that same point, right? I mean, in the same time that we are seeing this resurgent India, there are plenty of changes happening in America that are not so promising as well. There's sort of a hint of a cultural decline.
Oh
Um,
yeah.
do you see that as, you see that as valid?
Oh yeah. It's not a hint. It's a massive cultural decline.
Yeah.
It's everywhere, and it's quite sad because yeah, like it's one of those things where the US never really had anything that unified it except for money. Right? What do you come to the US for? You come to make money. You come for jobs. You come for the economy. There's no like shared culture and shared history. It's very like diverse set of people that are all coming here just to make money. And and then whereas like countries like India, they have a very strong culture, very strong history, very strong identity to it. And because of the lack of culture here, I just, we've seen it over the last decade where there is a huge cultural decline, and that's not, in my opinion, there's no reversing that. It's already on its way, and I think like America is sort of reaching the late stage capitalism, where uh, not every superpower can last forever, right? Every empire eventually dies. So you're seeing sort of the peak of America now, and I think countries like India have the opportunity to sort of rise up while the America is sort of on a steady flat line or even decline. And the thing I'd be very cautious about, though, is I think India historically has looked up to the US as almost like a role model. But I think it's very important for India to also look at the downsides of copying the US for what it is, and rather than copying, just think, be original, be innovative, and don't lose the sense of culture and shared history that India has, because you don't want to fall in the same traps that the US has fallen with the decline, you know. Because I'm starting to see that, on the fringes in India, where some of the, the wokeism, as it's called today, I'm starting to see some Indian accounts, kind of propagate that type of wokeism. And that's because they have access to the internet and they have access to people in the US who are promoting these ideas. And now they think those are good ideas because the US people are promoting them, and they're promoting them in India. And I think, like, you don't want this type of mentality to be infected amongst Indians, because
Yeah.
India will just fall to the same, will be prey to the same identity politics as the US.
Yeah. No, sometimes I think about it and I feel like it can only emerge in the most prosperous country in the world, right? I mean,
Yeah.
who would really
Yeah, I mean,
have
this
time for
happens
something
like
like that?
exactly. I mean, like the Roman Empire had, at the peak of it, it also started facing the same stuff, with the identity politics, gender stuff. All this stuff was happening. It happens, every time a society, or a country or a nation is sort of at the brink of its collapse, basically.
Right. So for some of us who are looking at that stuff from here, right? I mean, it kind of seems like it's a fringe movement or something on the outside, or something that the media picks up and highlights, right? But is that really mainstream there? I mean, and is that much of a what can I say? I mean, is that as much of an impact as it's made out to be?
Yep. I would say, if you asked me 5 years ago, I'd be like, oh no, that's on the fringes. Like, that's nothing to worry about. But like the scary part is that this type of stuff is being taught in schools, right? And you're starting to see, like, just scary stuff, like the whole transgender movement, and children being allowed to change their gender when they're young, and like all this crazy stuff. And you're like, how does this make any sense? And it's like these kids are being taught stuff um, from a young age, and so they end up getting older, and then basically they were taught this stuff since the last like 10 to 15 years. So now that generation is, in the 20s, and like that's the generation that's going to exist for the next, you know X number of decades. So that's not going away. It's only going to become more and more mainstream. And we have people here fighting back against it, for sure. There is the other side. Um, but it's one of those things where it's like, the ball's just going to keep rolling. I don't know if you can stop it.
Yeah.
I really just hope India doesn't fall on the same tracks.
Right. Yeah, I mean yeah, it seems bizarre, but I mean it's actually pretty serious, actually. And what are some other things that could possibly hold us back this decade? While there's a lot of optimism and stuff, one thing, as you mentioned, is this whole sort of woke culture, privileging rights over responsibilities, etc., coming
Yeah.
here and sort of destroying the foundations and cultural ethos, right? But anything else that you see as a threat for us in terms of growth?
Honestly, that's probably the biggest one, because I think all the drivers for India's growth are there. I think that the wokeness is yeah, preventing wokeness is definitely one. I mean, like the other big thing, I guess, is the government, and their ability to be a little bit more um, cooperative with sort of entrepreneurs. Sort of like, look at Singapore, right? Singapore designed its entire country around being entrepreneur friendly um, and business friendly. And I think if India can kind of, not that it has to be as business friendly as Singapore, because that's a really high bar, but like if it can kind of follow that as like a role model almost, and make starting a business in India really easy and incentivize entrepreneurs. Historically in India, that like being a entrepreneur was considered taboo, right? Like
Yeah.
it's very recent that like you can be an entrepreneur and like consider that like a reasonable thing to do. So I think like encouraging that culture, and that comes from the government,
Yeah.
encouraging and incentivizing that, in schools, in various like regulatory stuff, allowing public investors to come to India and actually invest in entrepreneurs there, because I know that there's been quite a few investors who tried to invest in Indian entrepreneurs in the last decade, and they said it was just such a headache. They have to do all this paperwork and they have to do all this like legal stuff, and the government can come in and make anything illegal at any time, and your company can just be destroyed as a result. So the government just being a little bit more reasonable and
Yeah.
forward thinking is definitely a big deal.
Yeah. No, I mean, so we did this whole episode on regulation. So the labor laws and regulation has been eased recently, right? I mean, they've struck down plenty of laws that were no good anyway in the first place. So I think the implicit assumption in India, even to a certain extent, even now, is the fact that a businessman is trying to hoodwink people, right? I mean, he's trying to hoodwink the government, at least, at the very least. And if you look at the generation that you spoke about, where entrepreneurship was not really aspirational, I mean, they really had nothing to look up to, because the honest entrepreneur in the whole license raj, which was extremely regulated, would not make a buck. Or I mean, you had the other variety who had to find ways and means around all of the laws and regulation, which meant doing all these shady activities, right? But it's only over the last 15 years that people have gotten to look up to the likes of Sachin Bansal, for example, or even Mukesh Ambani with the whole Geo thing, right? I mean, if you have these entrepreneurs right now who all of us can look up to, and I think that's a key cultural shift. And I think the government recognizes it as well, because simply the number of times the government mentions the word startup, whether it's in the Prime Minister's address or any key speeches and whatnot, right? I mean, it's just dramatically gone up over the last 5-10 years.
Yeah, I mean, that's awesome. And I was reading somewhere, for example, that the time to start a business went down a lot too. Like it used to take like months just to start incorporate a company, and now it's like a couple of weeks or something. So yeah, things like that. Yeah, like
Yeah,
I think like the government is definitely moving in the right direction. I think they can still do a lot more,
of course. Yeah,
and sort of really use Singapore as an example to follow.
yeah, yeah. All
Because I mean,
right.
I've heard that a lot of Indian entrepreneurs, for example, are going to Singapore because it's
Yeah.
just easier.
Yeah, they incorporate
Um,
there because
yeah.
it's easier to raise. All the funding related stuff is a lot
Yep.
more easier. Dealing with SEBI is not a trivial thing.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
yeah,
Yeah,
there's a
and you
lot of
know,
paperwork.
yeah, and you want to keep the entrepreneurs there. You want to keep them in India and keep them, incorporating in India. That way, you retain the talent. You don't want them
Yeah,
to leave and incorporate somewhere else, get funding from somewhere else, but like, build from India or something, right?
yeah, yeah. I think there are like two things happening, right? So one is that I think a lot more growth capital will make its way to India. You'll see a lot more
Yeah.
funds that are willing to invest like 40-50 million dollars upwards, right? Series B, Series C upwards. That will happen, and at the same time, I think the regulation will definitely catch up, because they do recognize this, right? The fact that people are sort of incorporating in Delaware or Singapore to sort of yeah, to for all of these reasons. So I think they will catch up. I think so too.
Yeah. 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 Hopefully.
So, Preeti, we've discussed plenty about what India could be like this decade. My final question is, if you had sort of a wish list, right? Like three things that you could wave with a wand and make happen this decade for India, what would they be?
Three wish lists. Huh. Interesting. One is that crypto doesn't get banned.
Okay.
That's going to be huge for India. Um, Two is, oh gosh. Um, Two is that I hope that we see a lot more seed through growth stage capital in India, really like, and not just Indian, like basically global money moving into India, and investing in Indian entrepreneurs and recognizing an opportunity there. I think that'd be huge for just startups in India. Um, what else? If I can wave a magic wand. Three is like, it goes back to like, I hope that India does figure out a way to preserve its culture while it's competing in the global coming decade. And I hope that it, you know, that it doesn't lose its culture.
Yeah. No, I think that's super important to hear that, I mean, it's good for us to listen to that a little more, and
Yeah.
recognize our own innate strengths in our culture because, the kind of history that we're taught or in general, I mean, the mindset that we have is that, we look to the West for all the good stuff, right? All the innovation and
Yeah.
everything. So, yeah,
Yeah. And then I think like now that worked in the past when the West was on the rise.
yeah,
But now as the West starts to, flatline or even decline, hopeful that, you know, people will be taught sort of the negative, the downsides of it too.
yeah,
And like it's like one of those things where, as when you see someone else succeeding, you think that you have to copy them to be like them, but then in copying them you lose a part of yourself.
hmm,
So it's more about like looking at what made this person successful and then looking at your own strengths and kind of creating a new definition of success,
right,
right?
right.
I think like that's the way India should think about how it wants to succeed in the global market.
Yeah. Like absorb all of the good stuff and be mindful of the bad stuff as well.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Preeti. This has been a fascinating conversation.
Awesome. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thanks. Bye bye.
All right. Bye.
Good night. Thank you for tuning in. This podcast was brought to you by the team at Bharatvaarta. If you liked this podcast, then don't forget to share, subscribe, and rate us on your favorite platforms. We're available on Anchor, Apple, Google, Spotify, Stitcher, Breaker, YouTube, and a host of other platforms. We started Bharatvaarta to facilitate long form discussions on politics, policy, and culture. We don't necessarily endorse anything that was said in this episode. If you do wish to offer us any feedback on the content or anything else, do reach out to us on social media or get in touch with us on our website, www.bharatvarta.in. The links are in the description below. Thanks again for tuning in. Until next time, stay safe, take care, and Jai Hind.